Well, I can speak from the DC perspective, and that DC was one of the first jurisdictions to actually pass a language access law in 2004. And so that Language Access Act requires DC government agencies to provide language access to all people that are trying to access services. So it's a really important law in DC, one of the first jurisdictions to have such a law. That requires DC government agencies and contractors to provide interpretation in any language that someone speaks. And then they also need to provide translation in languages that meet a certain threshold. And so, under the DC Language Access Act, if someone's rights are violated, they have a right to file a complaint with the Office of Human Rights. And that complaint can be investigated. The Office of Human Rights can issue a determination finding that the agency was not compliant. The problem with the Language Access Act as it stands now is that the determination by OHR, Office of Human Rights, is where the inquiry ends. So they can find that an agency has violated someone's rights, and that's a finding in writing, but it doesn't have any teeth, as we like to say. And so I'm part of a group, like many people here today, probably the DC Language Access Coalition, that has been working to strengthen this law and make it actually enforceable. So we have been working, petitioning the DC Council for many years to pass an amendment to the law that would allow for, a fine against an agency or some other type of some other punishment, right, for not following the law. Because right now it's a law on the books, and people have that right to get that language access. But if agencies violate the law, there's no remedy, and the person is left without language access. So luckily, a few years ago, the DC Council did pass an amendment, the DC Language Access Something for Education Amendment. But importantly, it provided for a fine structure where agencies, if they don't follow the law and they're found in noncompliance, would have to pay a fine to the individual. So they would have to pay a fine for the first time. And then if they violated the law again, they would have to pay the fine again. And that passed unanimously in the DC Council. So, the DC Council indicated that it felt like this was really important, that they value language access in DC. Unfortunately, it passed, but it's unfunded. So the law is on the books, but it has not gone into effect. So unless the DC Council finds funding to pay for the bill, it's not going to go into effect. So this is, an ongoing struggle. We're proud in DC to be one of the first places that has a language access law on the books. And that has encouraged a lot of DC government agencies to provide that access. But, it's frustrating and kind of an ongoing struggle to make it actually enforceable. So that's where we are now. Thank you.
Perspective now from the district. Thank you. Council Member Taveras, you introduced the Immigration Services and Language Access Initiative in Prince George's County and also introduced a bill that created a language access compliance program in Prince George's County. What was the motivation to introduce these important advances in your community?
Well, it was historic, frankly, because again, we had initially tried to put forth this legislation in 2017, and it did receive a lot of pushback from certain council members, and it was incredibly watered down in 2017. And so we came back and we said, we've got to make it stronger. We've got a new council and we've got new players at the table who are more willing and more open to be receptive to this kind of legislation. And so because of that, we were able to get it through. And even then, we received a large amount of pushback from certain entities, and given the price tag that came with this legislation. And so we tried to work and compromise in order to build out the program the way it needs to be built out within the county. And so we focused initially on making sure that the Office of the Human Rights Commission had the staffing that they needed to execute such a program. We looked into identify which departments within the county already had staff that they could dedicate to this cause. And we were able to put it together and to say that we want to see an annual report starting January 31st, 2022. So that is next year. And so we were able to limit the mass mailings, the vital documents percentage to 5% of the population, or 10,000 individuals in the county, given that we have approximately 909,000 people and 22% of that are foreign born. You know, there's a strong likelihood that, you know, we're going to find a large, and most of them obviously are either Latino or French, Francophone. Those are going to be two populations that we are going to need to serve directly to that end. And so when I got involved, we were still working on the SOP, the standard operating procedures, and they weren't moving until I put in this legislation. Then the SOP got approved and we were able to start rolling. So now I think we're in a good position, but the one thing that still remains, and we had to take it out in order as part of the compromise, was the enforcement piece. And we did have an initial strong enforcement piece in the first draft. But in order to compromise, we had to take it out and remove it. But, you know, I think that once we are in a situation where the program has been well implemented, well analyzed, and we start seeing the numbers coming in, and we start seeing the analysis, the complaints, et cetera, then we can institute an enforcement piece that I think will be reflective of what's needed to have a full-fledged program that serves the needs of the community.
Amazing. It's a work in progress, definitely. At least we have these two perspectives from two different jurisdictions in our area. So now let's talk about language access and courtrooms, which is very important as well. As you all have seen in your line of work, language barriers can prevent individuals from getting the assistance they need. Paul, and based on your experiences, can you share with us the consequences of inadequate language access, for example, in a courthouse setting? What happened when that happened, when you've seen those cases?
Sure. Let me first of all say thanks a lot to Ayuda for inviting me to this cool program. To respond to Alvin's question, court-assigned professional language assistance at no cost to the parties is something that should be seen as essential to the fair and proper administration of any court system, and provides benefits to everyone, the parties, the court, and the public. Here's why. Without assistance, limited English proficient parties are not able to be present, participate, and understand court proceedings in the same way that English speakers do. Without an interpreter, they're effectively locked out of the courtroom. Fewer cases with limited English proficient parties can be settled informally through the court systems, depriving those parties of the benefits of a settlement and increasing the costs and delay for everybody else. Bearing in mind that the vast majority of both civil and criminal cases are settled, so this is important to everybody. Judges and juries have more difficulty understanding testimony from limited English proficient parties or witnesses, making it harder for them to get the facts. And no court can function properly without being able to get the facts straight to begin with. Confidence in the court system is undermined if it appears to be treating people unfairly based on their language ability. The unfairness is often visible and apparent to everyone who's present in the courtroom. Inadequate management of language assistance creates unneeded, unfair delays for parties who need interpreters, and it increases the cost for them as well as the court. The court needs to plan for and manage interpreter assistance and avoid the problem that results when no one seems to realize that an interpreter is needed until the person walks into the courtroom. Lastly, providing language assistance outside the courtroom is of equal, if not greater, importance to courtroom interpreting. Limited English proficient parties need access to all court services and programs, whether it's the clerk's offices, online information and systems, forms, notices, and signage, settlement programs, classes that the court runs, and court-appointed officials like guardians and attorneys. In short, providing language assistance is critical to the basic functioning of the courts and a necessary service to provide due process to limited English proficient individuals.
Thank you, Paul. And Allison, I would like to ask you, from your experience, what are some of the challenges that limited English proficient clients experience in the courts, and what are some concerns your clients have expressed to you?
Yeah, so again, we're lucky in DC, I think, to have kind of responsive entities for as far as places that people are having to go to get public services. So that the same goes for the courts in DC. The courts created a language access advisory committee in 2016, which is I'm on, and some other folks here are also on that. And that is, includes legal services attorneys who practice in the courts, and then also clerks and other representatives of different branches of the court, to kind of get together and say, these are the things we're seeing, these are the problems, and then give the court a chance to respond. And so there have been a lot of changes in DC, improved signage, increased translations of court forms and things like that online. Court staff and judges have been retrained on language access. So some of the issues that Paul just brought up, identifying, training people on how to identify when someone needs an interpreter early on and things like that. There have still been some challenges, and I can speak to, specifically during the pandemic, some challenges that have come up with remote hearings. So most of the courts in DC are operating virtually. So people are having to attend either by video or by phone only. One of the issues with interpretation is that most of it is consecutive interpretation now. And previously, when we were in person in court, it was mostly simultaneous interpretation. So simultaneous interpretation, the person has the NEP has headphones on, the interpreter can be standing just behind them, essentially interpreting at the same time that words are being said. So that means it takes about the same amount of time as it does for an English speaker to participate in the hearing. Now with, virtual hearings, it's taking at least twice the amount of time for cases to be heard. And so, we have seen some frustration from judges, I think, at how long things are taking, maybe not fully understanding or tuning out because it's just taking so long to do the consecutive interpretation. That's not the case for ASL, as you see tonight. ASL can interpret simultaneously, but for spoken languages, it's basically being done consecutively. And so DC courts are working. They have some sort of overlay or something that they're looking into for WebEx, which is how we're doing our hearings, so that they can do more simultaneous interpretation in other languages. So that's a really important access to justice issue that, again, they're taking seriously and are working to do that. The court is also working to make sure notices are sent out in other languages. It's really, really important. So many hearings got canceled and then continued out because of the pandemic, that now they're having to reach out to a ton of people to let them know about new hearing dates. And we are urging the court to create notices in English, Spanish, and Amharic for everybody, because the court often doesn't know what language people speak. And in DC, Spanish and Amharic are the most spoken languages besides English. So, and finally, I'd say another thing the court has done in DC to address problems with people trying to access information is developing a phone app. So there's a DC courts app now. It's up in English at this point, where you can actually go in and look up your case information, you know, judges' contact information, which would help if people are having difficulty accessing the online hearing. So it's a phone app, and they are working with the Language Access Advisory Committee for tips, for any advice we have about converting it into Spanish and Amharic. So once that's up and running, I think, you know, DC courts will have done a lot to address some of the complaints or issues that we've been hearing from people. And I think that's, you know, something to be optimistic about.
Right, Allison, thank you. And we need to add to the mix as well the impact of the COVID-19. So now I want to talk to Council Member Taveras, because we are really grateful for all the work you have been doing to educate the public about COVID-19, including sharing the impact this virus has had on your family. We even had that on the newscast. So we send our condolences to you and your loved ones, and we are extremely grateful for how you continue to fight and raise awareness about the needs of those who have been negatively impacted the most. So as you know, the impact of COVID-19 has hit marginalized groups especially hard. The disparities that these communities already face have become even worse. Councilmember Taveras, as a community advocate, can you share with us some of the challenges that LEP, deaf, hard of hearing folks have been experiencing during this time, during the pandemic?
Most definitely, most definitely. Thank you, Alban. I'll start with and thank you for the condolences. I was just talking with my madrina today about funeral expenses that we're having in Santo Domingo, and dealing with that today. But so it kind of brings it forward even more. But I do want to talk a little bit about the matter at hand and the issues that the community has been facing. So, and I want to tie it in with a little bit of the discussion that was just had prior. We know that about 80% of landlords are represented by lawyers. And in this situation, we know that our communities during COVID-19 have not received monies during the first issuance of the federal government stimulus or the second. And there were tweaks on the second. And so we had to fight in order to get some kind of level of funding for families that had ITN numbers, had provided tax returns and so on, and even legal residents that were not even covered in the initial stimulus package. So these are families, again, that have reduced hours, are most likely they're not essential workers, and they're really on the front lines of everything that's been happening. I mean, we've heard of family and live in overcrowded housing, and dealing with the fact that they've got children that are now virtually learning, and they still have to pay the rent, still have to pay bills, and so on. And so with that, there was a little bit of a moratorium, but for those individuals that owed money prior to COVID, they were now being allowed to, as of, I believe, the end of the year, they were being allowed to be evicted. So that's an issue, right? Because if they go over, like I said, 80% of landlords are represented in court, and typically only 20% of tenants are, if they even show up. And so that's really, and most of the time, obviously, somebody who's represented wins. So we are now fighting in Annapolis to make sure Delegate Juanica Fisher's bill to get everybody represented in court when they go before the court system in an eviction case. Another thing is that Delegate Wilkins is now trying to pass a bill similar in the same vein, where now COVID-19, it can be used as a defense to prevent eviction. So that's another positive. I myself was trying to put it in a bill, and I'm working on the bill now to put in place that should have an illegal eviction have occurred, that the person has due process to be able to receive damages and court fees and legal fees. And the fact is that we're also, just to also mention that these are populations that are not only, they're receiving, so we're talking about housing in that sense and the challenges around housing. The other big challenge is the testing and the vaccinations, right? People who are LEP or NEP typically are challenged by the fact that they may not have the same computer access, linked and engagement with their local politician to know where the best, the latest, and testing sites are or vaccine sites are, so that they could get ahead of the game. And they don't have the time available, frankly, if they're working around the clock, 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, if they're even working, some hours here, some hours there, to be able to look up where they can go get vaccinated. And so that's been a challenge. And so to that end, I know that at least in my district, out of all the people that are infected, my zip code 20783 is the largest with the COVID-19 cases in the state of Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And we haven't received one COVID-19 vaccination site, and we have not received a COVID-19 testing site. We've only had pop-ups of COVID-19 testing here. And so it's been a challenge. We just opened up this week on Tuesday in Queens Chapel Road and East West Highway, the first testing site for vaccines. So on Monday, Thursdays, and Saturdays, people can get COVID-19 tested with a relationship with the First United Methodist Church of Hyattsville, Luminous Health Doctors Hospital, and the city of Hyattsville. So that's happening there. And on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, with the same relationship, we could also get vaccine tests done by appointment only. And so that's been, and now as of yesterday, we launched, I believe, a site at the Washington Adventist Hospital. And I think that may also be with a relationship with CASA and the hospital to provide vaccine exams, vaccine administrations there as well. And in the meantime, I've been working with Dr. Charles Vela, the founder of the STEM concept, to work together to see if we can work with our leaders here at the local, state, and federal level to be sure that we are working on proposing solutions for the level of disparities. And so far, nobody necessarily they've bitten, but they want us to do it for them. We're just trying to be able to advise. And so that's been the challenge that we've faced. They love it. Every time we present it to somebody, they love the idea of what we want to propose, but it's the resources in terms of the bodies that are needed to make it happen. So that's kind of where I am, because we need people on the ground that are able to speak with these people when they come in and say, hey, this is what you need to do to get vaccinated, and to get people registered, because a lot of our people, they may not even know how to get registered to get vaccinated. And that's telling, given that, like I said, 20% of the people in my district are COVID-19 positive. Of all the county, 20% live in my district, yet maybe we're 1 out of 10 that's vaccinated, or maybe even more, 1 out of 27.
Excellent information. Thank you for the details so we can understand the context as well, Council Member Taveras. And now going back to the court's poll, I would like to ask you, many hearings are being held remotely still, and operations are constantly evolving, they're changing. How are the courts still ensuring language access during the pandemic?
Yeah, so this is something that varies widely between the states and sometimes within particular states varies from county to county. As courts first shut down, then they started to reopen with restrictions and sometimes lately have been adjusting those restrictions or closing down again due to health conditions. When it comes to language access, pandemic variations have been added on top of pre-pandemic differences in policy and practice that have important implications for people who need interpreters. And again, some courts are better at this than others. Many of us have become accustomed to working, going to school, or socializing on remote platforms. Most court systems have been able to pretty quickly move onto online platforms for court proceedings. It's been working fairly well with the occasional glitch with a cat showing up instead of an attorney. But we know at the same time that this big change in how we communicate with each other has also reinforced existing barriers related to income, language, and race. Remote court proceedings can be done with a remote court interpreter supporting it on some meeting platforms or with effective add-on software. This can even be helpful in the sense that it makes interpreters more available because they don't need to live nearby and can even save the court money because they don't need to pay for travel. But the platforms differ on this. As Allison mentioned, some platforms are simply not built to support court interpreting. They end up degrading the experience of either the party who needs the interpreter or the interpreter and the other people, leaving some or all of them unable to see and hear the other people in the hearing clearly. The LEP party and the interpreter really need to have a built-in separate audio channel to allow simultaneous interpreting while they are able to maintain sight of everybody else in the hearing. Because a lot of the platforms can't do this, everyone ends up frustrated by having to use consecutive interpreting, which dramatically lengthens the time needed for a hearing. It's also really important, and some of the other speakers touched on these issues, to have clear and translated instructions for LEP parties, and also to think about providing them with alternatives for those who don't have sufficient bandwidth, technical savvy, or even a computer or a laptop that are all needed to effectively connect to a remote hearing and be able to present their evidence. Some courts, for an example, have set up safe, hardwired workstations for remote hearings inside their courthouses or in a community location, so people who can't do this from home effectively are able to participate. With court buildings closed or having restricted access, the need for more access to information and better service on the telephone with posted signage, information on the internet is increased. It's really important to notify LEP parties in their own language of closed buildings, remote hearings, and the like, so that they are not put at tremendous disadvantage because they're not receiving the information that's only sent in English. We don't want them, as we've seen in some instances, being the only people who are still showing up at the courthouse when it's closed and everybody else knows that except for them. Or if they're operating under special restrictions that they need to know about in advance so they can get in the door. For courts that have resumed in-person services and in-person court hearings, obviously safety concerns need to be taken care of, including how notice is provided and how equipment, protocols, and scheduling changes are made to reduce the number of people present, protect the interpreters, and make it safe for everybody that's inside the building. Just as an example, it's a good idea that courts would provide all the interpreters that come into the building with clean wireless headsets so they can interpret without standing next to the person or witness. And it's helpful if the local jurisdiction thinks about interpreters as frontline workers when it comes to vaccinations, so that they don't have to worry about that when they go inside the building. We know of instances where court interpreters have died from COVID, with their colleagues blaming it on inadequate courthouse safety procedures. So this is very important for them as well as for everybody else.
All right, thank you, Paul. Allison, as we know, non-dominant languages are often overlooked when it comes to community information or resources. So what structures and platforms need to be addressed to ensure all languages and voices are heard?
Sorry, can you see me now?
Yeah, we do now. Yes.
Or
and
hear
we
me
can
now? I froze.
Don't worry.
I froze momentarily. So, I think like all things, like language access advocates are always saying, you have to build language access into any system when you're building it from the beginning. You can't create a new system and then try to go back later once you realize that it's not accessible for speakers of other languages. We've seen in DC a lot of critical resources being put online during the pandemic. So there was a huge pivot to online sign-up systems for different resources, developing materials like infographics to provide to people once they could no longer go in person to DC government agencies to ask questions about things like COVID. And so, in a rush to get this information out, understandably, because it's a pandemic, a lot of these materials were created just in English at the beginning. And that persists for some of these resources. So for instance, in DC, the registration site to sign up for COVID vaccinations was initially not available in any other languages. So even if you could navigate the system, if you were a Spanish speaker and you got to the end, you couldn't fill out the form. So they were using Google Translate as a widget to basically translate the body of the web page. But then when you got to the actual fillable form to try to sign up for a slot, that form was not translated into any other languages. So the Google Translate widget just simply did not work on that. That was something that wasn't thought of ahead of time when the system was built. It was created and somebody thought, we'll just insert Google Translate into this and that will take care of our obligation to provide language access. And the most critical portion of that did not work with Google Translate. And so that didn't work. Now it's been fixed. So the coronavirus is now a pre-registration site in DC where you sign up to then get contacted to sign up for an appointment. That now has an application portal available in other languages. So it's been corrected, potentially after some media coverage about the problem. And then, there's other DC government agencies that have kind of risen to the occasion, that were thinking about this from the beginning. So the DC Department of Human Services, which is where you apply for benefits, critical benefits during the pandemic, like food stamps, TANF, a lot of people applying for the first time as they lost their jobs or needed the additional support. That moved from an in-person system to a fully online system. So it's both through a phone app and then an online system now. They did not initially do it in other languages. They only did it in English, but then pretty quickly moved into a workable online platform that allows you to submit applications for benefits in other languages. So in DC, again, that's just Spanish and Amharic. Those are the languages required under our Language Access Act. It may be different in different jurisdictions. And then other DC government agencies have not risen to the occasion. So there's this new DC Department of Housing and Community Development has created a COVID-19 housing assistance program. So that's a special program to help people pay for rent, people who are behind on their rent. And it's an online form that's been created. The acronym is CHAP for this program, COVID-19 Housing Assistance Program. And there is not even a Google Translate on the page. So you can't get onto the page to get the information. And then the application is only in English. So it hasn't been translated. So, we're seeing a hodgepodge of, some agencies that have stepped up and really provided these critical resources and others that still have not. And so again, I'll put in one final plug for DC to create an enforcement mechanism for our DC language access law, because all of these agencies with these critical resources are required to provide translations in Spanish and Amharic and are required to provide interpretation. There's nothing we can do except complain at this point and try to get the media involved, because at the end of the day, there's nothing really to hold them accountable. Thank you.
Great, Allison, thank you. I've seen that you've been answering some questions on the chat function that we have on the Zoom webinar. We have participants right now, so if anyone has a question, you can type it there for our expert. And I have one question here that someone has already asked that I will read out loud. It says, what is usually the reason that language access is not provided? Lack of training, lack of funding, resources, prejudice. Danny Taveras, maybe you can help us with that one first.
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. Well, sorry, my dog is acting up a little bit. We have the same situation that was highlighted, that Allison highlighted, in the sense that we had the pre-registration at first was only in English, and now it was translated. It's been translated since then, and we had a rental assistance program also available that it was too complicated for our people basically to apply to. So the first couple of, even though despite the fact that the first couple of people, we have 61% of renters in my district, they weren't able to benefit to the fullest extent of the law to benefit from these programs until now. We're trying to work around that and provide inside organizations that can work with them in Spanish. But in terms of your question, the first argument that was put in place against language access was that, well, if we have a person inside the agency that is a bilingual person, where will the person that was in that capacity that had a job as a communications person or PIO, will that person's job get removed? So it was really about the power dynamics in the county with regards to who's taking whose job, rather than serving the need of the population or addressing a serious need. And to me, we also see it in the fact that we don't have enough people in the police system that are police officers in fire, as EMTs, et cetera. We just don't, right now, we are 35% of the school system and 6% of the staff that may speak Spanish or that is higher level are Latino. So, I mean, and this is even in schools that are predominantly Latino. You could wish that maybe even the frontline person speaks Spanish. That may not even be the case. So again, it's a dynamics of the politics. The fact is of the, a little bit of the blockade and the, how would you say about a little bit of the entitlement of who owns the jobs, so to speak, and now wanting to open up the positions for to have diversity, inclusion, and equity in that sense.
All right, Paul, maybe you can help us with the next question. It's, how can we communicate language access rights and services to folks who do not have legal representation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just goes back to some issues that we were touching on before. There are tons of people that go into courthouses all across the country, when they're open at least, every day without an attorney, and many of them without much proficiency in English. So the whole system needs to be set up so that it's not reliant on the presence of an attorney to, in effect, explain everything to their client, even if, and that assumes that they're able to do that if there's a language issue. So the notices, the signage, the instructions, the interpreters in court proceedings, the translations, all that needs to be done. It's a comprehensive package to make sure that people have a decent shot of being able to participate on a relatively equal basis.
Okay, Allison, this question should be for you. It's about DC residents. Is there a way to provide language access directly to LEP, NEP, DC residents rather than them needing to go through an agency or to a court?
Yeah, this is a question. I responded in the Q&A that I didn't know the answer to this one, but I think it's a great idea. Like this idea of having something more grassroots where people could go to get things translated or work out issues with free interpreters. Yeah, right now it's going into an agency and getting that language access, or the court, or going to an organization that's going to provide interpretation. But it would be great to have community areas where people could go in and get interpretation to resolve a dispute. There's a dispute with their landlord, like go in on a Sunday morning and they know there's someone there that speaks Mandarin that can, help them work through that. I think it's a lovely idea. I don't know how to do that, but yes.
All right, thank you, Allison. And I would like to read the last question. What are some of the changes that you have seen over the years in language access? Maybe we can start with you, Council Member Taveras. Main changes.
I think that slowly but surely people are changing. So for example, let's say I was able to institute a program called ISLA, the Immigration Services and Language Access Program. And that we started it again, like I mentioned it, in 2017. And we just started with like $100,000. I mean, casi nada, like almost nothing. And now it's grown to $500,000 where, and basically, I want to say that the county's putting in, and it's over a $2 million budget, where we got the Immigration Justice Corps in coalition with CARE, where we're now, we went from representing a small number of individuals by lottery in immigration detention centers for deportation to now representing every single member of the county who's in deportation proceedings, who cannot afford to hire their own lawyer, can now have access to a free lawyer. I mean, that's incredible, right? So hearts are softening, And I think as more people get married with each other, I think that people, you know, they start to learn about each other's culture, recognize that people really care about the same issues, care about the same things. And slowly but surely, you know, I think we start to get to know each other, right? And so, and I think that while there may be some really negative naysayers, it's probably also because they haven't really met anybody outside their immediate circle. Like once they start to meet individuals and really meet them, not, oh, I'm complaining about a mattress outside my house. You know what I mean? Like once they start to really meet them, I think that hearts start to soften, because I know a lot of seniors here, they are involved in civic associations where there's a lot of negative rhetoric, but when you close the door and sit down in their living room and they're offering you tea, they're like, well, actually my neighbor does my landscaping and he really takes care of me. And, you know, and there's like this protective code of our seniors here in the community by Latino families. So, you know, I think that as we grow as a community and we start bridging gaps, you know, closing gaps here, I think that the hearts of the people that be in politics will start to soften. And obviously, I mean, I'll put in the political angle a little bit if you will allow me, and not so political, because I recognize that you guys are nonpartisan. But I think that this is this vaccination rollout is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to do voter registration. And I will say that every single chance I'm going to get from now until we're done with this. We can register every single person to vote, and then we got to turn them out to vote. And with that vote, I think we'll also have a greater voice to determine what we're asking for and demand the things we feel we deserve.
Thank you very
much. That we deserve.
Sure. Thank you. And well, there's been a lot of information shared today. So if someone new to this topic, let's say, were to take one or two main takeaways from this discussion, what should they be? Paul, I want to start with you. We will just have 1 minute for each person to answer that. What would be the main takeaways?
First of all, when it comes to at least federally funded programs and services, language access is a civil rights issue, and failure to provide language access is a form of discrimination that violates federal law, and in some cases, as in DC, state or local laws. The other thing is that regarding the pandemic, because it's come up a lot, I mean, we've seen that it's increased disadvantages to limited English proficient people. So there is an immediate need for vigilance, making quick service adjustments to ensure access to information and services, as well as advocacy. It's obviously, as we've heard tonight, this is not just an issue for the courts. It's a big problem in the way vaccines are being distributed. And we're seeing this all over the country, that the distribution system and the methods that are being used are putting people at risk based on whether they speak English, the color of their skin, and the income they have.
Allison.
I think she's frozen.
Oh, yeah, she might be. So let's
I totally agree with everything that Paul just said. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, I think I'm unfrozen now.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that Paul just said. I think always, anything that's going to be built needs to be done with an eye towards language access. Our LEP, NEP community members cannot be an afterthought that are added in afterwards, only when complaints are brought. Any new systems that are being built, they are part of the community, right? Like, you're developing systems for a community, you have to include them from the beginning. So that's what I would like people to take away. Thank you.
Council member.
And obviously I agree with everything that's been said here tonight and by the previous two speakers, but I would just urge people that We do have an office of the Human Rights Commission that is tasked with overseeing and enforcing and addressing disparities and addressing the enforcement of these legislations. So even as a human rights issue. So I would say, do not be afraid. We do have individuals in the office that are speak multiple languages. And I would say, do not be afraid. And we are here to stay. So you need to exercise your voice and exercise your rights, regardless of whether you're documented or not. That's because that's where it starts.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for such an informative and impactful discussion. It is necessary to have moments like this where we can come together and shine a light on the resources that limited English proficient, deaf, and hard of hearing people need. Personally, I have learned so much in this hour. I am already thinking of new stories that we can produce together to raise awareness on these topics that are so important. And one of the main takeaways that I will have is when Denny said, you know, go out and meet someone different than you, empathize, try to learn from this person, you know, and it will be definitely different. It will soften your heart, it will change your mind. So I think this is a very good first step for everyone that is not that related to the topic. I want to also give a special thank to you, Ayuda, and all the Ayuda's members for their commitment in supporting hundreds of limited English proficient, deaf, and hard of hearing individuals each year, and ensuring that these communities here in DC, in Maryland, in Virginia, in the DMV region get the assistance they deserve regardless of the language they use to communicate. So your language access program is one of a kind, and I'd now like to welcome Language Access Manager, Paige Jordan, who will close out this evening program. Paige.
Thank you, Alvin. I would also like to thank our panelists for all the excellent insight and the important work that they do every day to ensure language equity for everyone in our community. We're so grateful for all the information that's been provided today, and we really hope that this discussion really motivates you all to be aware of issues in the community that don't meet the needs of limited English proficient and deaf or hard of hearing folks, and that it encourages you to be more vocal advocates for this. And no one deserves to feel like an afterthought. Allison mentioned that before, and language barriers can put basic services out of reach for those people. And together we can make our communities prioritize the needs of limited English proficient, deaf, and hard of hearing communities, and we can make sure that critical resources are accessible. So thank you all for listening, learning, and spending your evening with us. We also hope that you will join us on May 6th at 6 p.m. for IUTA's signature event, Standing with Immigrants, Champions of Change, as we celebrate our clients and our community members who have remained resilient and continually make a positive change in the society. You can find tickets for this virtual event in the chat box. And if you have a few minutes to spare at the end, please take time to fill out a brief survey. We would appreciate that. And you can also follow IUTA on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, or you can visit our website at iuta.com to be the first to know about any future events like this one. So thank you all.
Okay, I can leave now. Okay. Bye. Thank you.